There is a moment in every person's life when everything they have learned, everything they have endured, everything they have quietly prepared for suddenly becomes necessary. For most of us, that moment comes softly. A challenge at work, a difficult conversation, a loss that must be grieved. We reach into ourselves and find, perhaps to our own surprise, that we have resources we did not know we possessed. But for some, that moment arrives like thunder. On September 9th, 1965, a 41-year-old Navy commander named James Bond Stockdale was flying his A-4 Skyhawk over North Vietnam when anti-aircraft fire tore through his aircraft. In the seconds that followed, as his plane became a fireball and he reached for the ejection handle, Stockdale had a thought that would define not only his own survival, but would come to illuminate the very nature of human resilience. "I am leaving the world of technology," he said to himself, "and entering the world of Epictetus." In that single sentence lies a mystery worth unraveling. Who was this man who, in the moment of his greatest crisis, reached not for prayer or panic, but for philosophy? How does a fighter pilot from small-town Illinois come to carry the words of an ancient Greek slave into combat? And what does it mean to truly prepare for trials we cannot yet imagine? Tonight, we begin the story of Admiral James Stockdale. Not the story of his captivity, though that will come. Not yet the story of his extraordinary endurance, though we will walk that dark road together. Tonight, we tell the story of his making, of the years before he needed to be unbreakable, of the quiet accumulation of wisdom that would one day save his life and the lives of those who depended upon him, of how a philosophy born in ancient Athens found its way into the heart of a 20th century warrior, and there became something more than words. This is the story of preparation, of the work we do before we know why we are doing it. The land itself seemed to prepare him. Abingdon, Illinois sits in the western part of the state, where the prairie stretches out in every direction like a meditation on patience. The winters there are long and unforgiving, the summers blaze, and in between, the wind moves across the flatland with a kind of ancient constancy, as if reminding everyone who lives there that nature operates on its own terms, indifferent to human preference. James Stockdale was born there on December 23, 1923, in a house that knew both hardship and love. His father, Vernon Stockdale, worked the land and later sold farm equipment, a practical man who understood that machines require maintenance and that promises must be kept. His mother, Mabel, had been a school teacher before marriage, and she carried in her the particular kind of strength that comes from believing that education is the one inheritance no one can take away. The Great Depression had already begun its slow devastation of the American heartland by the time young Jim was old enough to understand such things. He watched his neighbors lose their farms. He saw his father work longer hours for diminishing returns. He learned, without anyone having to explain it, that life is not obligated to be fair and that complaining about unfairness changes nothing. This was not a lesson delivered in words. It was absorbed through observation, through the daily witness of adults who faced difficulty without drama, who did what needed to be done because it needed to be done. The Stoics have a concept for this. They call it the discipline of assent. It means accepting reality as it presents itself, neither adding to it our fears nor subtracting from it our wishes. The farmers of Depression-era Illinois practiced this discipline without knowing its name. They planted because planting was what farmers do. They hoped for rain but prepared for drought. They did not expect the universe to reward their efforts, but they made their efforts anyway. Young Jim Stockdale was watching and learning. There is a particular kind of education that happens in small towns, far from universities and lecture halls. It is the education of proximity. You see how the blacksmith handles disappointment. You observe how the minister's wife responds to gossip. You watch your own parents navigate the 1,000 small indignities that life delivers, and you file away their responses for later use. Jim Stockdale was a watcher from the beginning. Quiet by nature, he had what his teachers would later call an unusual intensity of attention. When someone spoke, he listened not just to their words, but to the architecture beneath the words, the assumptions and values that made certain sentences possible. His mother recognized this quality early. She fed it with books, bringing home volumes from the small local library that were perhaps too advanced for a boy his age, then discovering that no book seemed too advanced for this particular boy. He read history and biography with special hunger, drawn to stories of how men and women had faced their defining moments. What did Washington think as he crossed the Delaware? What sustained Lincoln through those years when the Union seemed destined to fall? How did ordinary people become capable of extraordinary endurance? These were not idle questions for young Stockdale. They were research. Even then, though he could not have articulated it, he was conducting an investigation into the nature of human character. He wanted to know what people were made of. More specifically, he wanted to know what he might be made of when his own testing came. The Stoics teach that we must distinguish between what is up to us and what is not. Our circumstances are not up to us, whether we are born rich or poor. In times of peace or war, to loving parents or indifferent ones, these things lie outside our control. But how we respond to our circumstances, what we make of what we are given, this remains entirely our own. In Abingdon, Illinois, Jim Stockdale was given a Depression childhood, a father who worked with his hands, a mother who believed in the power of the mind, and the endless prairie wind that seemed to whisper that small things must learn to bend or they will break. He took notes. Character, the Stoics believed, is not given but forged. It is hammered into shape through countless small decisions, through the daily practice of choosing one response over another. No single moment creates character. Rather, character is the accumulated weight of 10,000 moments, most of them forgotten, all of them contributing to who we become when the great test finally arrives. Jim Stockdale's adolescence was unremarkable in its events, but formative in its texture. He played sports, though he was not particularly gifted athletically. He studied, though not with the obsessive focus of a future scholar. He worked alongside his father, learning the rhythms of physical labor, the satisfaction of a job completed, the quiet dignity of contributing to the family's survival. What set him apart, even then, was a kind of seriousness that his peers found difficult to name. He could laugh, he could play, he could enjoy the ordinary pleasures of youth. But underneath these normal activities ran a deeper current, a constant questioning, a refusal to simply accept the surface of things. Why do people behave as they do? What makes some men honorable and others corrupt? Is courage something you are born with, or something you can cultivate? These questions hummed beneath the surface of his days like a continuous low frequency that only he could hear. He did not burden others with his philosophical preoccupations. He simply carried them, turning them over in his mind during the long walks home from school, during the quiet hours of farm chores, during the moments before sleep when the mind is most free to wander. His high school years coincided with the gathering storm in Europe and Asia. By the time he graduated in 1942, America was at war. The Depression had ended, replaced by something worse and better, a national purpose that demanded everything and promised nothing except the chance to matter. For a young man who had spent his childhood wondering what he was made of, the war presented itself as an answer to an unasked question. Not as adventure, not as escape, but as test. He enlisted in the Naval Academy. The United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, is designed to break young men down and rebuild them as something new. This is not cruelty, but necessity. The sea does not forgive weakness. Combat does not accommodate self-doubt. The institution that produces officers for the United States Navy must therefore be a crucible, a place where the soft parts are burned away and what remains is tested again and again until only the essential survives. Jim Stockdale arrived at Annapolis in the summer of 1942, one among hundreds of young men who had answered their country's call. They came from farms and cities, from wealth and poverty, from every corner of a nation suddenly unified by the necessity of war. They did not know each other yet, but they would become brothers in a particular way, forged by shared suffering into a bond that would last their lifetimes. The first year at Annapolis is called plebe year, and it is intentionally brutal. Upperclassmen exist, it seems, for the sole purpose of making plebes miserable. Every action is scrutinized. Every failure is punished. The young men are permitted almost no sleep, given impossible tasks, criticized mercilessly for their inevitable shortcomings. Many do not survive. They quit, or break down, or simply realize that this life is not for them. There is no shame in this, not really. The Academy is designed to sort those who can endure from those who cannot, and it accomplishes this sorting with ruthless efficiency. Stockdale did not merely survive plebe year, he recognized it. Where others saw only harassment, he perceived a hidden curriculum. The upperclassmen were not simply cruel. They were teaching, in the most visceral way possible, that external circumstances cannot be allowed to determine internal states. They were demonstrating that a man can be shouted at, humiliated, exhausted, and pushed beyond what he believed were his limits, and yet remain, at his core, intact. This was Stoicism before he had a name for it. There is a passage in the writings of Epictetus that Stockdale would not discover for another 2 decades, but which perfectly describes what the Naval Academy was teaching him in the language of physical hardship. "It is difficulties that show what men are," Epictetus wrote. "Therefore, when a difficulty falls upon you, remember that God, like a trainer of wrestlers, has matched you with a rough young man. For what purpose? That you may become an Olympic victor, but this cannot be done without sweat." The academy was full of rough young men, and Stockdale sweated among them. He learned to make his bed so tightly that a coin would bounce off the blanket. He learned to recite, on demand, obscure facts about naval history, the menu for the day, the number of days until the Army-Navy game. He learned to stand at attention while being screamed at, his face betraying nothing, his mind a still pond that refused to be disturbed by the storm above its surface. Most importantly, he learned that he was capable of more than he had imagined. This is perhaps the Academy's greatest gift to those who endure it, the revelation that the limits we believe we have are largely imaginary, constructed by a mind that prefers comfort to growth. When those limits are systematically demolished, what remains is a person who no longer believes in limits. At least not the arbitrary ones that most people accept without question. Stockdale's academic record at Annapolis was solid but not spectacular. He excelled in engineering and struggled somewhat with languages. But his performance in the classroom was never the point. The point was the man being formed beneath the academic surface, the character being hammered into shape by the relentless pressure of the institution. He graduated in 1946, too late for the war that had brought him to Annapolis, but in time for the uncertain peace that followed. He was commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy, a young officer with skills he had not yet fully tested and reserves of strength he did not yet know he possessed. The war was over, but his war had not yet begun. Every institution teaches two curricula. There is the official curriculum, the one printed in the catalog, measured by examinations and recorded on transcripts. And there is the hidden curriculum, the one that operates beneath the surface, transmitted through culture and example, absorbed rather than studied. At Annapolis, the official curriculum covered navigation, engineering, naval tactics, and the technical skills required to operate the most sophisticated machinery of war. This curriculum was rigorous and important. It produced competent officers who could do their jobs. But the hidden curriculum was where the real education happened. It taught that honor is not negotiable, that a man's word must be his bond, because in combat, lives depend on being able to trust completely the person beside you. That leadership is not about giving orders, but about being the kind of person others want to follow, even into danger, even unto death. Stockdale absorbed this hidden curriculum with the same intensity he had brought to watching his neighbors navigate the Depression. He studied not just the lessons but the teachers, observing which officers commanded genuine respect and which merely enforced obedience. He noted the difference between courage and recklessness, between confidence and arrogance, between the strength that inspires and the strength that intimidates. He was building, without conscious awareness, a model of the leader he wished to become. The Stoics teach that we become what we practice. If we practice anger, we become angry people. If we practice patience, we become patient. The person we are tomorrow is being shaped by the choices we make today, the responses we habituate, the character we cultivate through 10,000 small decisions that seem trivial in the moment but accumulate into identity. At Annapolis, Stockdale practiced discipline. He practiced self-control. He practiced the subordination of immediate comfort to long-term purpose. He practiced being the same person in private that he was in public, knowing that integrity means wholeness, being undivided, being one thing all the way through. He did not know that he was preparing for something specific. He only knew that preparation itself was good, that the work of becoming a better man was its own reward, regardless of what that man might one day be called upon to do. Graduation, Stockdale's path led upward, literally. He was selected for flight training, one of the most demanding and prestigious tracks available to a young naval officer. The Navy needed pilots, and it needed them to be extraordinary. The aircraft of the post-war era were faster, more powerful, and less forgiving than anything that had come before. The margin for error was measured in fractions of seconds. A pilot who hesitated, who doubted, who allowed fear to cloud his judgment, would not survive long enough to learn from his mistakes. Flight training strips away illusion with brutal efficiency. In the cockpit, there is no room for self-deception. Either you can fly the aircraft or you cannot. Either your reflexes are fast enough or they are not. Either you can maintain composure under extreme stress or you will die, probably taking others with you. Stockdale excelled. He had the physical coordination, the quick reflexes, the spatial awareness that flying demands. But more importantly, he had the psychological temperament. He could remain calm when alarms were screaming and the aircraft was shuddering and every instinct urged panic. He could think clearly in the moment of crisis, working the problem rather than freezing or flailing. In 1950, he earned his wings of gold, the insignia that marks a naval aviator. He was 26 years old, a pilot in the most powerful military force the world had ever known, trained to deliver death from above with precision and without hesitation. The Korean War had begun. Stockdale flew combat missions from the carrier USS Philippine Sea, learning what it means to face an enemy who is trying to kill you, what it feels like to return to the ship knowing that some of your brothers did not return, what kind of man you become when death is a daily companion rather than an abstract concept. He was becoming a warrior, but he was not yet a philosopher. Combat is the great teacher that everyone hopes they will never need. It strips away theory and reveals truth. It shows you, with clarity that cannot be argued with, who you actually are beneath the stories you tell yourself. In Korea, Stockdale learned that he was not afraid to die. This is not the same as wanting to die, nor is it the bravado of youth that has not yet comprehended mortality. It is something quieter and more profound, an acceptance that death is possible in any moment, and that this possibility, rather than paralyzing action, can actually clarify it. When you have accepted that you might not return from this mission, a strange freedom opens up. You stop worrying about things that do not matter. You focus completely on what needs to be done. You become, paradoxically, more effective because you are no longer wasting energy on fear. The Stoics understood this. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who spent years on the frozen frontier fighting Germanic tribes, wrote extensively about death, not morbidly but practically. He reminded himself each morning that he would encounter difficult people that day, and that he himself would one day cease to exist. This contemplation of mortality was not depressing to him. It was focusing. It helped him remember what actually mattered. Stockdale did not know Marcus Aurelius yet. He did not know that centuries before him, a Roman emperor had discovered the same truths he was discovering in the skies over Korea. He only knew that something was shifting inside him, that the experience of combat was rearranging his priorities and stripping away his illusions. He returned from Korea a different man than the one who had left. Not harder exactly, though there was a new hardness in him. Not colder, though he had learned to control his emotions with greater precision. What he had become was more concentrated, more essential. The inessential parts of his personality had been burned away by the heat of combat, and what remained was something purer and stronger. He was ready, though he did not know it yet, to encounter the philosophy that would give his experience a framework and a name. The years between Korea and Vietnam were years of preparation, though Stockdale could not have known what he was preparing for. He served on various ships in various roles, steadily climbing the ranks as he demonstrated the competence and character that mark an officer destined for command. In 1960, he received orders that would change everything. He was assigned to Stanford University as a graduate student in international relations, part of a Navy program designed to produce officers capable of understanding the broader context in which military force operates. For a pilot who had spent his career mastering the physical skills of combat, this was an unexpected turn. Academic studies seemed almost soft compared to the demands of flight and battle. What could books teach that experience had not? But Stockdale approached Stanford as he had approached everything else, with complete commitment. He threw himself into his studies with the same intensity he brought to flying. He discovered that the mind, like the body, could be trained and strengthened. He found that intellectual challenges, like physical ones, could be met and overcome through discipline and persistence. And then, in a philosophy course that was not even part of his required curriculum, he encountered a book that would become his most valuable possession. More important than any weapon, more powerful than any aircraft. The book was the Enchiridion of Epictetus. Epictetus was a Greek philosopher who had been born a slave in the 1st century AD. He had lived in Rome, where his master allowed him to study philosophy. Eventually freed, he began teaching, and his lectures were recorded by a student named Arrian in a short manual called the Enchiridion, which means handbook in Greek. It was a small book, easily carried. Its teachings were simple, almost deceptively so, and yet within its pages lay a complete system for living. A philosophy that had been designed not for comfortable academics, but for people facing genuine hardship. To understand what Stockdale found in the Enchiridion, one must first understand the man who wrote it. Epictetus was born around 50 AD in Hierapolis, in what is now Turkey. He was born into slavery, which meant that from his first breath, he had no control over the circumstances of his life, He could be sold, beaten, separated from anyone he loved, forced to work until he dropped. He owned nothing, not even his own body. And yet this man, who had every reason to despair, who faced a life of unending hardship through no fault of his own, became one of the most influential teachers in the history of philosophy. His students included senators and emperors. His ideas shaped the thoughts of Marcus Aurelius, whose Meditations remain one of the most widely read philosophical works of all time. How does a slave become a teacher of emperors? The answer lies in the central insight of Stoic philosophy, the insight that would become Stockdale's anchor through years of captivity. It is this: we do not control what happens to us, but we absolutely control how we respond to what happens to us. Our circumstances are not up to us. Our character is. Epictetus had been given the worst circumstances imaginable. Born a slave, he later became lame, possibly through abuse by his master. He was exiled from Rome when the Emperor Domitian expelled all philosophers from the city. He lost nearly everything a person can lose. And yet he remained free. Not physically free, but spiritually free. No one could touch the part of him that mattered most, the part that chose how to think, how to respond, what to value and what to dismiss. This inner citadel was impregnable, not because it was protected by walls, but because it was protected by will. It is not things that disturb us, Epictetus taught, but our judgments about things. In this single sentence lies the key to human freedom. The Enchiridion begins with a statement so simple it seems almost obvious, yet so profound that it takes a lifetime to fully understand. Some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, office, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. Read this carefully, and you will see that Epictetus is making a revolutionary claim. He is saying that our bodies do not truly belong to us, that our reputations, our possessions, our positions in society, all the things that most people spend their lives pursuing and protecting, are ultimately beyond our control. This sounds, at first, like a counsel of despair. If we cannot control our bodies, our property, our standing in the world, what is left? What is the point of effort, of ambition, of even getting out of bed in the morning? But Epictetus is not counseling despair. He is counseling clarity. He is saying that most people waste their lives worrying about things they cannot control while neglecting the one thing they can control, their own minds. They spend their energy trying to manipulate external circumstances while allowing their internal states to be determined by those same external circumstances. This is backwards. This is slavery to the world. True freedom, Epictetus teaches, comes from focusing entirely on what is within our power. Our judgments, our desires, our choices about how to respond to whatever happens. These and these alone are truly ours. Everything else is on loan, temporary, subject to being taken away at any moment. When Stockdale read these words at Stanford, something clicked into place. He had been intuiting this truth for years through his experiences in Korea, through his observation of how some men remained unbroken while others fell apart. Now he had the framework, the language, the philosophical structure that explained what he had witnessed and begun to practice. He was not merely reading a book. He was finding a home. What distinguished Epictetus from other philosophers, and what would make his teaching so valuable to Stockdale, was that Stoicism had been tested. This was not armchair philosophy, not the speculation of comfortable academics. It was wisdom forged in the same fire that Stockdale had experienced, the fire of suffering, limitation, and loss. Epictetus did not teach from a position of comfort. He taught from a position of having lost everything and discovered that everything that truly mattered could not be lost. He taught from the experience of being a slave who had found freedom, a cripple who had found strength, an exile who had found home. This authenticity resonated with Stockdale in a way that mere cleverness never could have. He was a combat pilot, a man who had faced death and would face it again. He had no use for philosophy that worked only in theory. He needed a philosophy that worked when the aircraft was on fire, when the enemy was shooting, when everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, and you still had to function. Epictetus offered exactly this. When you close your doors and create darkness within, remember never to say that you are alone, Epictetus wrote. For you are not alone, but God is within, and your guardian spirit is within. And what need have they of light to see what you are doing? This was not abstract theology. It was practical guidance for enduring solitary confinement, for maintaining integrity when no one is watching, for finding company in the depths of isolation. Epictetus had not written these words for comfortable students in lecture halls. He had written them for people in extremity, for people facing the worst that life can deliver. Stockdale began to carry the Enchiridion with him. He read it repeatedly, not as one reads a novel for plot and entertainment, but as one studies a manual for survival. He memorized passages. He thought about them during flights, turning them over in his mind like a pilot checking his instruments before takeoff. He was preparing, and this time he knew what he was preparing for. By the early 1960s, the storm clouds were gathering over Southeast Asia. The United States, committed to containing the spread of communism, was being drawn ever deeper into the conflict in Vietnam. What had begun as advisory support was becoming something larger, something that would eventually consume 58,000 American lives and reshape the nation's understanding of itself. Stockdale was now a commander, an experienced combat pilot with Korean War service behind him and the philosophical grounding of his Stanford years within him. He was no longer a young man, not in the way that combat pilots are usually young. He was 40 years old, a husband and father, a professional military officer at the height of his powers. In 1965, he took command of Carrier Air Wing 16, deployed to the Gulf of Tonkin aboard the USS Oriskany. He was responsible for coordinating the air operations of multiple squadrons, hundreds of men, dozens of aircraft. The weight of command sat on his shoulders, the knowledge that his decisions would determine who lived and who died. He flew missions himself, as a commander who asked nothing of his men that he would not do himself. He led strikes against North Vietnamese targets, facing the same anti-aircraft fire, the same surface-to-air missiles, the same risks that his pilots faced. He believed, as all good commanders believe, that leadership means being in front. And always, in the back of his mind, Epictetus was speaking. Keep death and exile before your eyes each day, along with everything that seems terrible. By doing so, you will never have a base thought, nor will you have excessive desire. Stockdale kept death before his eyes. He accepted, with the clarity that Stoicism provides, that he might not survive this deployment. He made his peace with this possibility. He focused on what he could control, his own conduct, his own choices, his own character, and released his attachment to outcomes that were not up to him. The date of September 9th, 1965 was approaching. The morning of September 9th, 1965, began like many others aboard the USS Oriskany. The ship was alive with the controlled chaos of flight operations, the orchestrated ballet of aircraft, fuel, ordnance, and men that makes a carrier at war one of the most complex human activities ever devised. Stockdale rose early, as he always did. He had developed habits of discipline that required no willpower to maintain because they had become part of who he was. He prepared himself mentally for the day's missions, reviewing the targets, the threats, the contingencies. He thought about the men who would fly with him, their capabilities and limitations, the trust they placed in him and he in them. He did not know that this was his last morning of freedom. No one ever knows such things. But he had prepared for this possibility, had accepted it, had made it part of his mental landscape. When he climbed into his A4 Skyhawk that day, he was not surprised by the presence of danger. Danger was his constant companion. He had learned to make it his ally rather than his enemy. The mission was a strike against a target in North Vietnam. The details hardly matter now. What matters is what happened next and what Stockdale did with what happened. As his aircraft screamed over the Vietnamese jungle, anti-aircraft fire found it. The impact was catastrophic. Within seconds, the aircraft became uncontrollable, a falling mass of burning metal that had moments before been a precisely tuned instrument of war. There was no time for fear. Fear is a luxury that requires time to develop, and Stockdale had no time. He had only his training, his reflexes, and his philosophy. His hands moved to the ejection handle. His mind was already working the problem, calculating the odds, accepting the outcome, whatever it might be. In the fraction of a second before he pulled the handle, he thought of Epictetus. I am leaving the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus. The ejection seat is a violent device. It must be. It has to propel a human body clear of a disintegrating aircraft in a fraction of a second, with enough force to overcome the aerodynamic forces that would otherwise trap the pilot in the wreckage. The acceleration is extreme, the violence sudden and total. Stockdale pulled the handle and the seat fired. In an instant, he was separated from his aircraft, from his squadron, from everything that had defined his life until that moment. He was alone in the air above enemy territory, descending under a parachute toward a hostile landscape that offered no comfort and no mercy. In those long seconds of descent, the full reality of his situation became clear. He was badly injured. his back damaged by the ejection, his leg broken. He was coming down in the middle of a village, visible to everyone, his parachute a beacon announcing his presence to those who would want to kill him or capture him. There was no rescue coming. He was too far inland, too deep in enemy territory. The helicopters that might save a pilot downed closer to the coast could not reach him here. He was, in the parlance of combat aviators, on his own. And yet, in the midst of this catastrophe, Stockdale experienced something unexpected. He felt, he would later write, a kind of calm settling over him. Not the calm of resignation, but the calm of clarity. The worst had happened. The thing he had prepared for, had contemplated, had accepted as possible, was now actual. And because he had prepared, because he had spent years studying how to face the uncontrollable with equanimity, he found that he was equal to the moment. Okay, he thought to himself as the ground rushed up to meet him. I'm going to prison. I'm going to survive this, and I'm going to do it right. This is what preparation looks like, not the avoidance of disaster, but the capacity to meet disaster with one's full faculties intact. He landed hard, his broken leg giving way beneath him. Within moments, he was surrounded by villagers, some curious, some angry, all aware that they had captured something valuable. An American pilot, alive, was a prize. He was a bargaining chip, a propaganda tool, a source of information. He was, from this moment forward, no longer a commander of men, but a possession of his enemies. They stripped him of his flight suit, his equipment, his identity as a military officer. They bound his arms behind his back. They paraded him through the village, a trophy for the cameras that would broadcast his capture to the world. His face was bloodied, his body broken, his dignity systematically assaulted. And yet, Epictetus had prepared him for this. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of things. The villagers could take his flight suit. They could take his freedom of movement. They could take his comfort, his health, his contact with everyone he loved. But they could not, unless he surrendered it to them, take his capacity to choose how to respond. In the first hours of his captivity, Stockdale made a decision that would define the next 7.5 years. He decided that he would not be broken. Not because he was certain he was strong enough. No one can be certain of such things until they are tested. But because the decision itself was within his power, and making it gave him something to hold on to, an internal commitment that was entirely his own. The North Vietnamese had captured his body. They had not yet encountered his will. They did not know that the prisoner they were marching through the village carried within him a philosophy forged by an ancient slave, a philosophy specifically designed for exactly this situation. Stockdale did not know how long his captivity would last. He did not know if he would survive it. But he knew what Epictetus had known, that the last freedom, the freedom of the mind, can only be surrendered, never taken. He resolved not to surrender it. In the mythology of survival, we often imagine that physical strength is what matters most. The strong survive, the weak perish. And there is truth to this, as there is truth to most myths. The body's capacity to endure hunger, pain, disease, and deprivation certainly plays a role in who lives through extreme circumstances. But the deeper truth, the truth that Stockdale would demonstrate over the next 7.5 years, is that mental strength is more decisive than physical strength. The body will endure almost anything if the mind commands it to. The body will give up, will surrender, will choose death over suffering, if the mind loses its grip on meaning and purpose. What Stockdale carried into captivity was not physical strength, though he was in good condition for a man of 41. What he carried was a framework for understanding his situation, a set of principles for navigating the unnavigable, a philosophy that had been designed by people who had faced similar extremity and emerged intact. He carried the dichotomy of control, the fundamental Stoic insight that some things are within our power and some things are not. His captivity was not within his power. How he responded to his captivity was entirely within his power. This simple distinction would save his life. He carried the practice of negative visualization, the Stoic technique of imagining the worst that can happen so that you are prepared for it when it arrives. He had been imagining this, contemplating capture and torture and isolation, not with morbid fascination, but with practical foresight. When the worst happened, he had already rehearsed it. He carried the concept of the inner citadel, the private fortress of the mind that cannot be breached unless its owner opens the gates. No matter what they did to his body, they could not enter this space without his permission. And he carried the example of Epictetus himself, a slave who had become free, a cripple who had become strong, an exile who had become an empire. If Epictetus could do it, so could he. The Hanoi Hilton. This was the name the American prisoners gave to Hoa Lo Prison, the central facility where most captured pilots were eventually taken. The name was a dark joke, a way of maintaining some scrap of humor in circumstances that offered little to laugh about. Stockdale arrived at Hoa Lo after days of transport, interrogation, and abuse. He was already injured from the ejection and capture. He would be injured many more times in the years ahead. The North Vietnamese had no interest in his comfort and every interest in his cooperation, which they would attempt to extract through methods that violated every principle of the Geneva Convention. But this is not yet the story of his captivity. That story belongs to the second chapter of our journey together. Tonight, we pause here, at the threshold, at the moment when preparation ended and application began. Let us understand what had been accomplished in the years before this moment. A boy from small-town Illinois had observed his community navigating hardship with dignity. A young man at the Naval Academy had been broken down and rebuilt as something stronger. A combat pilot in Korea had learned that death could be faced without terror. A graduate student at Stanford had discovered a philosophy that gave structure to his experience. And now all of this came together. All the years of watching, learning, training, and studying converged on a single point. The philosophy that had been absorbed in comfort would now be tested in extremity. Stockdale later wrote that he never felt more certain of anything than he did walking into that prison, not certain that he would survive, for no one can be certain of outcomes, but certain that he was prepared, that he had the resources to face whatever came, that the work he had done before this moment was exactly the work that was needed. I had the fortune of having been educated, he would say, before I was tested. This is the gift he gave us, the lesson of his early life. Get educated before you are tested, because when the test comes, there will be no time to study. In the years that would follow, Stockdale would put Epictetus into practice in ways that the ancient philosopher could never have imagined. He would endure torture and isolation. He would lead a clandestine resistance movement among the prisoners. He would create codes and communication systems that allowed the captives to support each other even when kept in separate cells. He would make decisions that seemed, from the outside, impossible. When the North Vietnamese wanted to use him for propaganda, he beat his own face with a stool to make himself unpresentable. When they threatened to torture him for information, he slit his own wrists, preferring death to betrayal. These were not the actions of a madman. They were the calculated responses of a man who understood, with crystal clarity, what was within his control and what was not. He could not control whether they tortured him. He could control whether he cooperated. He could not control whether they used him for propaganda. He could control whether his appearance was useful to them. He could not control whether he lived or died. He could control whether his death had meaning. This is Stoicism in extremis. This is what the philosophy was designed for. Not for making comfortable people slightly more philosophical, but for making unbearable circumstances bearable. Epictetus had not written for the academy. He had written for the prison. And Stockdale proved that the philosophy worked. Not because he emerged unscathed, for he did not. He was permanently damaged by his captivity, his body broken in ways that never fully healed. But his mind, his character, his essential self, these emerged intact. He had been tested in the fire and not found wanting. The philosophy had held. The preparation had been sufficient. The slave's wisdom had saved the warrior's soul. But this is not merely a war story. It is not merely a tale of one remarkable man's endurance. It is an instruction, a lesson offered to all of us who will face our own trials, however different they may be from Stockdale's. We may never be shot down over enemy territory. We may never face torture or imprisonment. Our tests may be quieter, less dramatic, invisible to the world. The loss of a job, the failure of a relationship, the diagnosis that changes everything, the grief that seems to have no bottom. But the principle remains the same. There are things we can control and things we cannot. Our circumstances so often are not up to us. Our responses always are entirely our own. The question is whether we will prepare, whether we will do the work before the work is needed, whether we will study the philosophy, practice the principles, build the inner citadel before the siege begins. Stockdale did not become unbreakable in the Hanoi Hilton. He became unbreakable in Illinois, at Annapolis, in Korea, at Stanford. He became unbreakable through 20 years of watching, learning, training, and studying. When the test came, he was ready because he had been preparing his entire life. This is what Stoicism offers us, not the promise of a life without hardship, for no philosophy can offer that, but the possibility of a self that can withstand hardship, a character that bends but does not break, an inner freedom that no external force can revoke. Epictetus taught it. Stockdale lived it. And now the teaching passes to us. What will we do with it? If you would walk the path that Stockdale walked, you must begin as he began, not with grand gestures, but with small practices. The Stoic philosophers understood that character is built through repetition, through the daily accumulation of choices that gradually become habits and eventually become identity. Begin each morning as Marcus Aurelius did, by reminding yourself that you will encounter difficulty, not because life is miserable, but because expectations shape experience. If you expect the day to be easy and it is hard, you will feel wronged, cheated, victimized. If you expect the day to be challenging and prepare yourself accordingly, the same difficulties will feel like opportunities for practice. Throughout the day, practice the dichotomy of control. When you feel frustration rising, pause and ask yourself, is this thing I am frustrated about within my power or outside it? If it is within your power, act. If it is outside your power, accept. This simple practice, repeated hundreds of times, will gradually rewire your relationship with circumstance. In the evening, review your day as the Stoics recommended. Not with self-criticism, not with excuses, but with honest assessment. Where did you respond well? Where did you respond poorly? What can you do differently tomorrow? This is not rumination, which cycles endlessly without resolution. This is analysis, which seeks to learn and improve. And read. Read the Stoics themselves, not just commentary about them. Read Epictetus, whose Enchiridion is short enough to complete in an evening and deep enough to study for a lifetime. Read Marcus Aurelius, whose meditations offer the private thoughts of a man trying to be good in the most powerful position on earth. Read Seneca, whose letters to his friend Lucilius provide practical guidance on everything from grief to wealth to the use of time. These are your teachers. They have been waiting for you. There is a misunderstanding about preparation that must be addressed. Many people believe that preparing for hardship means worrying about it, dwelling on possible disasters, living in a state of constant anxiety about what might go wrong. This is not what the Stoics taught. This is not what Stockdale practiced. True preparation is calm. It does not add suffering to the present by anticipating suffering in the future. It simply acknowledges that suffering will come, accepts this acknowledgement without drama, and then returns attention to the present moment where life actually happens. Stockdale did not spend his years before capture in constant fear. He enjoyed his life, loved his family, took pleasure in his work. But he also maintained an awareness, a readiness, a philosophical grounding that would be available when needed. He was like a fire extinguisher in a kitchen, present and prepared, but not interfering with the cooking. This is the paradox of Stoic preparation. By accepting that you cannot control the future, you actually become less anxious about it. By acknowledging that bad things will happen, you become more capable of enjoying the good things when they are present. By preparing for death, you become more alive. The unprepared person lives in a kind of unconscious denial. They know intellectually that they will face difficulty, but they have not integrated this knowledge emotionally. When the difficulty arrives, it feels like an outrage, a violation, a personal insult from the universe. Their suffering is doubled, the pain itself plus the pain of feeling that this should not be happening. The prepared person suffers only once. The pain is still real, the difficulty still difficult. But there is no secondary layer of resistance, no indignant protest that this is not fair. The prepared person has already accepted that fairness is not guaranteed, that difficulty is part of the deal, that the universe makes no promises. This acceptance is not resignation, it is freedom. James Stockdale lived to be 81 years old. He was released from captivity in 1973 after 7.5 years as a prisoner. He returned to a nation that had changed, to a family that had endured its own trials waiting for him, to a body that would never fully recover from what had been done to it. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. He rose to the rank of Vice Admiral. He served as president of the Naval War College, where he taught a new generation of officers the philosophy that had sustained him. He wrote books and gave lectures, spending his remaining years transmitting what he had learned. But his greatest gift was not his heroism, impressive as that was. His greatest gift was his example. He showed us what is possible. He demonstrated that a human being, properly prepared, can endure almost anything. He proved that the philosophy of the ancient Stoics was not merely beautiful theory, but practical truth. And he did it without bitterness. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his story. After 7.5 years of torture, isolation, and degradation, he emerged without hatred for his captors. He understood that they too were trapped in circumstances beyond their control. He had compassion for them even as he opposed them. This is the deepest teaching of Stoicism. It is not just about enduring hardship. It is about enduring hardship while maintaining your humanity. It is about facing enemies without becoming like them. It is about suffering without becoming smaller. Stockdale showed us that this is possible. He walked the path before us. And now the path remains, waiting for those who would follow. So we return to where we began, to the question that has been humming beneath the surface of our time together. What are you preparing for? You may not know. Stockdale did not know specifically that he would be shot down over Vietnam. He prepared generally, building a character capable of meeting whatever might come. He studied philosophy not because he knew he would need it in a prison cell, but because he knew he would need it somewhere, sometime, in some form he could not predict. The tests that await you are unknown. They may be physical or emotional. They may involve loss of health, loss of wealth, loss of people you love. They may be sudden or gradual, visible to the world or hidden in the privacy of your own heart. But they will come. This much is certain. The only question is whether you will be ready. Readiness is not about knowing what will happen. It is about building the capacity to respond well to whatever happens. It is about developing strength before you need to be strong, cultivating wisdom before you need to be wise, practicing calm before the storm arrives. The Stoics offer a path. It is not the only path, but it is a proven one. For 2,000 years, in circumstances ranging from imperial palaces to slave quarters to prison cells, people have found in Stoicism a framework for meeting life on its own terms. James Stockdale carried this framework into the worst circumstances a modern American has faced. He emerged with his mind intact, his character strengthened, his humanity deepened. If he could do it there, surely we can do it here in the smaller trials of ordinary life. This then is the invitation. Not to admire Stockdale from a distance, but to join him on the path. Not to study Stoicism as a historical curiosity, but to practice it as a living discipline. Not to prepare someday, eventually, when the time is right, but to begin now, tonight, with whatever small step presents itself. Read the Enchiridion. It is short. You could finish it before sleep comes. Let the words of Epictetus enter your mind, and then let them rest there, working quietly beneath the surface of your thoughts. Tomorrow morning, when you wake, take 3 minutes before you rise. Remind yourself that the day will contain difficulty, not to make yourself anxious, but to make yourself ready. Accept this difficulty in advance, so that when it arrives, you recognize it as expected, manageable, part of the deal. Throughout the day, when you feel frustration or anger or despair rising, pause. Ask yourself, what part of this is within my control? Focus your energy there. Release as best you can your attachment to the parts you cannot control. This is the practice. This is the path. And in the evening, before sleep, review what happened. Not with judgment, but with curiosity. Where did you respond as a Stoic would? Where did you forget everything you know and react from fear or pride or wounded ego? What can you learn? What can you practice tomorrow? This is how character is built. Not in dramatic moments of crisis, but in the quiet accumulation of daily choices. By the time Stockdale was shot down, he had already made the choices that mattered. He had already built the character that would sustain him. You have time, but not unlimited time. The test could come tomorrow. It could come in a decade. It could come in ways you cannot imagine. Better to be ready. James Bond Stockdale died on July 5, 2005. He was 81 years old, surrounded by family, at peace. The man who had survived torture and isolation, who had led his fellow prisoners with courage and wisdom, who had proven that the human spirit can withstand almost anything, died quietly in his own bed, his work complete. But the teaching does not die. This is the nature of philosophical transmission. Epictetus learned from Musonius Rufus, who learned from others before him, in a chain stretching back to Zeno of Citium, who founded Stoicism in Athens around 300 BC. The wisdom passes from generation to generation, finding new carriers, adapting to new circumstances, remaining essentially unchanged across millennia. Stockdale was one link in this chain. He received the teaching from Epictetus across 20 centuries. He tested it, proved it, and passed it on. His students at the Naval War College carry it now. His books carry it. His example carries it. And now, perhaps you carry it too. This is how philosophy works when it works correctly. It is not information to be stored, but wisdom to be lived. It is not content for consumption, but practice for transformation. When you truly understand what the Stoics taught, you cannot remain unchanged. The understanding itself changes you if you let it. Stockdale let it change him. He did not study Stoicism as an academic exercise. He allowed it to rewire his assumptions, reshape his responses, rebuild his character from the inside out. By the time he needed the philosophy, it was no longer something he knew. It was something he was. This is the invitation, not to know about Stoicism, but to become Stoic. Not to admire the warriors who came before, but to join their ranks. The hour grows late. The night deepens around us. Perhaps you are already drifting toward sleep, the words becoming part of the rhythm of your rest. This is as it should be. The best wisdom enters not through forced study, but through gentle absorption, settling into the mind like rain into soil. Let the story of James Stockdale sink into you. Let the teaching of Epictetus find a home in your thoughts. You do not need to remember every detail. You do not need to master the philosophy tonight. You only need to allow the seeds to be planted, trusting that they will grow in their own time. Tomorrow you will wake into your own life with its own challenges and opportunities. You will face small tests, probably. The difficult coworker, the frustrating traffic, the unexpected expense, the disappointment that comes from loving people who cannot always love you back. These small tests are your training ground. Every time you choose to respond with equanimity instead of anger, you strengthen the muscle that will sustain you in larger trials. Every time you distinguish between what you can control and what you cannot, you practice the dichotomy that saved Stockdale's life. There is no distinction, really, between preparation and life. The preparation is the life. The small moments are the practice. The philosopher you are becoming is being shaped right now, in this moment, by how you receive these words and what you do with them. So rest now. Let the night do its work of consolidation and integration. The teaching is inside you now, mixing with your own experience, your own questions, your own character. When you wake, it will still be there, changed by its passage through your unique mind, ready to be applied in ways that only you can apply it. The path is yours now. We will meet again in the next chapter of this story. There is so much more to tell. The years in the Hanoi Hilton, the resistance he led, the codes he created, the men he saved. The Stockdale paradox, his famous insight about optimism and realism that has guided leaders in every field. The return home, the adjustment to freedom, the decades of teaching and writing that followed. But for tonight, we end where his great trial began. We leave him walking through the gates of Hoalo prison, injured but unbroken, alone but not lonely, facing the unknown with the tools that a lifetime of preparation had given him. He carries with him nothing but what no one can take away: his judgments, his choices, his character, his soul. Everything external has been stripped from him. And yet he remains complete, because he has learned that completion does not depend on external things. This is the lesson. This is the gift. This is what the slave Epictetus taught the warrior Stockdale, and what Stockdale now teaches us. You are not your circumstances. You are not your possessions. You are not your reputation, your position, your body, or your history. You are the one who chooses how to respond to all of these things. You are the will that navigates through whatever life presents. You are the inner citadel that cannot be breached. This is freedom. Not the freedom to have everything you want, but the freedom to remain yourself regardless of what you have or do not have. This freedom is available to everyone in every circumstance at every moment. It was available to Epictetus in slavery. It was available to Stockdale in prison. It is available to you tonight, wherever you are, whatever you face. The question, as always, is whether you will claim it. And now, rest. Let the story settle into you like sediment to the bottom of a still pond. Let the philosophy find its place in your mind, not through effort but through release. The work of the day is done. The practice of the night is surrender, letting go, allowing sleep to do what only sleep can do. You have walked with Stockdale tonight. You have heard the voice of Epictetus across 2,000 years. You have contemplated what it means to prepare, truly prepare, for the tests that life will bring. This is enough for one night. This is more than enough. Tomorrow the practice continues, but tonight, rest. May your sleep be deep and restorative. May your dreams be kind. May you wake tomorrow with renewed strength and clarity, ready to meet whatever comes with the equanimity that the Stoics taught. And when you think of James Stockdale, as perhaps you will from time to time, may you remember not just his suffering, but his strength. Not just his captivity, but his freedom. Not just what was done to him, but what he chose to be. He was a man who prepared. He was a man who endured. He was a man who emerged from the darkness with his light unextinguished. May we all be so fortunate. May we all be so prepared. Good night. We will continue in the next chapter with the story of the inner citadel, the fortress of the mind that Stockdale built during his darkest years. But that is a story for another night. For now, sleep. And know that the philosophy watches over you as it has watched over countless others across the centuries. A companion for the long journey, a light for the dark road. Rest well.